The moment Florence Merritt rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, her wagon wheel cracked clean in half on the rutted Main Street, and every man on the boardwalk turned to stare, except the one she needed most. He was leaning against the post outside Hargrave's Feed and Dry Goods, a tall man with sun-darkened skin, and the kind of stillness that told you he had either seen too much or felt too much, possibly both. His hat was pulled low, his arms were crossed, and his eyes were fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the street around him. When the wheel gave out with a sound like a rifle crack and the wagon lurched sideways, spilling Florence's trunk and 3 boxes of medicinal supplies across the mud, he moved before any of the watching men had even uncrossed their own arms. He was there in 4 long strides, catching the side of the tilted wagon with his shoulder, so the remaining crates did not follow the first ones into the dirt. Florence grabbed the bench rail and held on, heart pounding, and looked down at the man bracing her wagon with what appeared to be sheer, quiet stubbornness. "You all right?" he said. His voice was low and rough, the kind that had not been used for pleasant conversation in a while. "I am now," she said, which was the honest truth. His name, she learned within the hour, was Lewis Donovan, and he was the best wheelwright in 3 counties, which was apparently why he was the one person on that street who had not been surprised by her misfortune. He had seen the wobble in that wheel from across the street before she'd even pulled up to the post, he told her later. He had been waiting for it to go. Florence Merritt was 26 years old, a trained nurse who had come west from Cincinnati with a letter of introduction in her coat pocket, and a contract to work under Dr. Elias Feld at the new medical office he was establishing in Caldwell. She had brown hair that she kept pinned with more optimism than success, gray eyes that people sometimes called sharp and sometimes called kind, depending on what they needed from her, and a directness of manner that had made her plenty of enemies back in Ohio and promised to make her just as many out here on the plains. She was not fragile. She was not afraid. But she was alone in a town she did not know, and when Lewis Donovan replaced her wheel with competent, unhurried hands and charged her exactly what the job was worth and not a penny more, she thought that whatever else Caldwell had to offer, it had at least offered her this. A man with honest hands and honest eyes, even if those eyes looked like they were carrying something very heavy. She paid him. She thanked him. She drove the repaired wagon down the street to the medical office. She did not expect to see him again so quickly. Lewis Donovan was 34 years old, a rancher with a spread of 400 acres 5 miles south of town, a man who had been in Caldwell for 6 years, and who was known to be reliable, quiet, and not given to socializing beyond what commerce required. He had a foreman named Gus Pelly who was loud enough for 2 men, a small crew of cowhands he paid fair wages, and a reputation for being one of the few ranchers in the county who did not cheat his men or his neighbors. He also had, Caldwell knew, a past. The particulars of that past were not discussed, at least not where Lewis might hear. People spoke of it in that careful way that communities adopt when a man's grief is still tender enough to cut anyone who brushes against it. 3 years it had been, going on 4, and nobody who valued their standing in Caldwell said a word about it to his face. Florence did not know any of this yet. She spent her first week in Caldwell learning the layout of the medical office, arranging supplies in the way that made sense to her rather than to Dr. Feld, who had the organizational habits of a man who had worked alone for too long. Feld was in his late 50s, bearded, kind, and somewhat chaotic, and he welcomed Florence's systematic approach with the relief of a man who had been waiting for it without realizing he had been waiting. Together, they made the small office function. Together, they treated the steady stream of ranch injuries, riding accidents, fevers, and the occasional gunshot wound that came through the door of a cattle town in the fall. She met Lewis Donovan again on a Wednesday, 9 days after her arrival, when he came in with his foreman Gus, who had managed to break 2 fingers, and his pride in the same accident involving a stubborn gate latch and a startled horse. Florence set Gus Pelly's fingers with brisk efficiency while he complained at great length about the indignity of the whole thing, and she did not bother hiding her smile at the fact that his employer stood in the corner of the room looking somewhere between amused and long-suffering. "Does he complain this much normally?" she asked Lewis. "More," Lewis said. "I am standing right here," Gus said. "I know," both Florence and Lewis said at the same moment, and then they looked at each other and something passed between them that was smaller than a smile but more significant than nothing. After that it became a habit, the kind of habit that neither person acknowledges because acknowledging it would require addressing it. Lewis began to appear at the medical office not always with injured cowhands, though those came too, but sometimes simply passing through town who happened to be there at the end of the working day. He would bring felled tobacco sometimes, which the old doctor received gratefully. He would bring Florence nothing, because he was not a man who knew how to bring a woman something without it meaning too much, but he would stay and talk if she was between patients, and those conversations had a quality to them that Florence began to look forward to in a way that was both pleasant and slightly alarming to her. He talked about the land. He talked about cattle prices and the changes that were coming with the railroads pushing further west. He talked about weather with the careful attention of a man whose livelihood depended on reading it correctly. He was not a man who filled silence for the sake of it, and so when he spoke, Florence listened, because it was worth listening to. But there were things he did not say. She noticed the silences that had shapes to them, the way he would begin something and let it trail, the way certain subjects would surface for just a moment in his expression before he pushed them back down. She noticed that he lived alone in his ranch house, that Gus and the Hands had their own bunkhouse, and that nobody in town ever mentioned family when they mentioned Lewis Donovan. She did not press. She was a nurse. She understood that some wounds announced themselves and some wounds did not, and both kinds needed to be treated with patience. October settled over the Kansas plains with a chill that smelled like wood smoke and dry grass, and Caldwell tightened itself against the coming winter the way small towns do, with storm shutters and laid-in supplies and the social drawn together that cold weather brings. The cattle drives that had kept the town loud and rough through the summer months had slowed, the cowboys moving south and east, and what was left of Caldwell was its permanent population, which was quieter and, Florence found, considerably more interesting. There were things happening in Caldwell in 1882 that Florence had not expected, and that the letter of introduction from Cincinnati had not prepared her for. The town was caught in the middle of a long argument between its ranching community and the small farmers who were beginning to arrive, drawn by railroad pamphlets promising free land and rich soil. The farmers wanted to put up fences. The ranchers wanted the open range. It was an argument that was happening all across Kansas in those years, and in Caldwell it had a particular edge because the two sides had to do business with each other whether they liked it or not. Florence tried to stay out of it. She treated injuries from both sides of the fence argument without bias, and she held her opinions about land rights close, because she was new and she was careful. But she noticed that Lewis Donovan was not entirely among the ranchers who wanted blood over the fence question. He was measured about it in a way that some of the other cattle men were not. She heard him say, in the feed store one afternoon when the argument flared over the counter, that a man who worked the land had a right to it regardless of what he was growing. It cost him something to say it. She could see that. Some of the men looked away from him the way men do when they are recalculating someone. She thought about that for a long time afterward. The first time Florence Merritt and Lewis Donovan spent a real evening together, it was not planned by either of them. It was the 3rd week of October, a cold evening with stars that looked closer than they had any right to be, and Florence had been called out to the Hennessy homestead 6 miles east of town, where Mary Hennessy had gone into early labor. Florence had ridden out with her bag and her steady hands, and Lewis had been at the Hennessy place by chance because Jonas Hennessy owed him a debt of fence posts, and they had been negotiating the terms of delivery all afternoon. The baby came into the world healthy and loud at close to midnight, and by the time Florence had seen mother and child settled and comfortable, it was past the hour when any sensible person should be riding alone across open country. Jonas Hennessy pressed her to stay the night, which was genuine hospitality, but the house was small and crowded with 3 existing children and a new infant, and Florence did not want to add to the inconvenience. Lewis had been waiting by the horses in the yard. He had not said he would wait, and Florence had not asked him to, but there he was, and when she came out pulling her coat tighter against the cold, he was already beside her horse, checking the cinch. "You do not have to accompany me," she said. "I know," he said. They rode back toward Caldwell through the dark and the cold and the enormous silence of the Kansas plains at midnight, and Florence thought she had never seen sky like this, could not have imagined it in Cincinnati, this profound and indifferent darkness that made a person feel both very small and very free at the same time. "It gets to you," Lewis said, and she turned to look at him. "The sky, the size of it. I have been out here 6 years and it still gets to me. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" He was quiet for a moment, considering it genuinely. "Both," he said. She nodded. She felt that. She thought she would always feel that. They reached the edge of town and paused at the junction where their directions split, hers toward the rooming house where she boarded and his toward the road south to his ranch. The cold had reddened his cheekbones, and she could see his breath in the starlight, and he was looking at her with that expression he sometimes wore that she could not fully read, that looked like something wanting to surface. "Thank you," she said, "for riding back with me." "Of course," he said. She turned her horse. He did not move immediately, and she could feel him still watching as she rode up the street. But she did not turn around because she was 26 years old and she was not a girl, and she was not going to turn around over a man she had known 3 weeks. But she did smile, alone in the dark, which she supposed was essentially the same thing. It was Gus Pelly who told her, as most things were transmitted in small towns, not deliberately, but in the way that words fall out of people when they are comfortable and unguarded. He had come in to have Florence check his healing fingers on a slow Friday afternoon, and she had been asking him easy questions about the ranch to pass the time, and he had answered them easy and loose the way he always did, because Gus Pelly had never had a thought he did not eventually speak out loud. "He has run the place alone since his wife passed," Gus said, holding his hand steady while Florence examined the knuckles. "Going on 4 years this January. Me and the boys help keep it together, but it is not the same as having family." Florence kept her hand steady and her expression neutral. "He had family." "2 boys," Gus said, and then something shifted in his face and he looked down at his hand, and Florence understood from the sudden quality of the silence that she had walked to the edge of something without meaning to. "They passed too," Gus said quietly. "All 3 of them. Fever winter of 79. Took them one after the other inside of 2 weeks. He shook his head. "I have never seen a man survive what Lewis survived that winter, and I do not mean survive in a manner of speaking. I mean I was not certain he would make it through to spring." Florence did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not be inadequate. "He has not talked about them since," Gus said. "Not to me, not to anyone. You will not hear him mention their names. It is like a door he has locked, and he does not even walk past it anymore." She finished examining his hand. She told him the fingers had healed well. She walked him to the door and closed it behind him and stood for a moment in the quiet medical office with the weight of what she now knew pressing on her chest like something physical. She thought about Lewis Donovan's eyes. She thought about that middle distance he sometimes stared into. She thought about the way certain silences had shapes, and she finally understood the shape of his. She did not approach it. Not yet. She was a woman who knew how to wait, and she knew that some things could not be hurried without breaking. November arrived, and with it, the particular busyness of a prairie town preparing for winter in earnest. There were 2 significant snowstorms in the first 2 weeks of the month that whitened the plains and iced the roads and brought in a run of frostbite cases, and one man who had been caught in the first storm 3 miles from shelter, and had come through it more or less intact, but for a deep and resonant cold that settled in his lungs and kept him in bed for a week. Florence managed all of it with the calm efficiency that had become her signature in Caldwell and Dr. Feld told anyone who would listen that she was the finest nurse he had ever worked with, which, given that he had worked in Philadelphia and St. Louis before coming west, meant something considerable. Lewis Donovan came into town less during the storm weeks. The ranch required constant attention in the cold, and the roads were not kind to regular travel. But when the second storm cleared and the sun came back sharp and brilliant over the white plains, he appeared at the medical office door on a Tuesday morning with a cough he admitted had been building for 10 days. Florence listened to his chest with the stethoscope that had come all the way from Cincinnati with her, and told him his lungs were clear, but that he needed to stop riding out before dawn in wet cold and expecting his body to simply accommodate it without consequence. "I have work in the mornings," he said. "You will have more work if you spend 2 weeks in bed," she said. He conceded the point, which she noted was something she had observed him do more readily than most men: actually listen and respond to reason, rather than simply dig in against it on principle. She made him a preparation of willow bark and honey, and something she had learned from an older woman in Cincinnati who had a reputation for practical medicine that predated any formal training, and she told him to take it morning and evening for a week. He took it. A week later he came back and the cough was gone, and he told her so. "I know," she said. "I made you the right preparation." He almost smiled. It was one of his almost smiles, the ones that got close without quite completing the journey, but she had learned to read them, and they meant the same thing a full smile on another man would mean. She had been thinking about what Gus had told her for 3 weeks. She had been turning it over the way you turn something fragile, carefully, looking for the right way to hold it. She was not going to force it. She was not going to introduce it into a casual conversation on a Tuesday morning in a medical office. But she was aware that what she knew had changed the way she saw him, not with pity, which would have been wrong, but with a fuller understanding of who he was and what he was carrying, and she thought that mattered. She thought it mattered enough that she was no longer content to simply watch him lock the door and keep walking past it. The evening that changed things came on the 12th of November, a Thursday, cold and clear, with a moon so full and bright it cast shadows on the snow. Florence had been invited to supper at the home of Margaret and Robert Crane, who were the closest thing Caldwell had to a civic-minded couple. They held a small supper every few weeks for the town's professional residents and Caldwell-adjacent personalities, and Florence had been attending since early October, finding it a useful way to understand the town's social architecture. Lewis was there, which surprised her slightly because she had not known him to be the supper party type, but she gathered from the way he arrived quietly and positioned himself at the edge of the room that he came not for the conversation, but because he and Robert Crane had a long and mutual respect that went back to the early days of both their arrivals in Caldwell. The evening went pleasantly. There were 8 people at the table. Conversations about the railroad expansion and the upcoming mayoral election, and whether the new schoolhouse would be finished before winter bit too hard. Florence sat across from Lewis and watched him navigate the social evening with the economy of a man who could be present without demanding anything from the room, and she thought again how unusual he was, how distinct from what she might have expected from a frontier rancher. After supper, the group migrated to the Crane sitting room, where Robert had laid a fire that was generous and warm, and the conversation grew smaller and more personal in the way that fireside conversations do. People dispersed into pairs and small clusters, and Florence, without quite planning it, found herself near the edge of the fire where Lewis was standing alone, looking into the flames. "You are thinking hard about something," she said. "I usually am," he said. "That is not reassuring or alarming, I cannot decide which." He looked at her then, a direct look that he sometimes gave her that she had come to think of as the real look, the one behind the one he gave everyone else. "You are settling in well," he said. "The town likes you. The town needs a competent nurse. I am filling a need. That is not the same as being liked. Dr. Feld says you are the best he has worked with." "Dr. Feld says that to my face. I have no idea what he says otherwise." "He says it to everyone else too," Lewis said, "including me, unprompted, last week at the feed store." She felt something warm in her chest at that, something she did not bother to pretend away. They were quiet for a moment, watching the fire, and Florence thought this was as natural as breathing, standing next to this man in a warm room on a cold night, and she thought that was something worth honoring. "Gus told me," she said quietly. She did not say what Gus told her. She thought Lewis would understand. He went very still. Not tense, not defensive, just still, the way a person becomes when they are making a decision. "I did not ask him to," she said. "It came up in passing. I wanted you to know that I know, and that it does not change how I see you except to see more of you, if that makes sense." He did not say anything for a long moment. The fire popped and resettled, and one of the other conversations in the room went up in brief laughter and came back down. "It has been a long time since anyone has said something like that to me," he said finally. "I imagine a lot of people have not known how to approach it. Most people do not approach it at all," he said. "Which I have generally been grateful for." She let the silence sit. She did not ask. She had said what she meant to say, and she was not going to push further, and she felt him weighing that, felt him understand that she was offering a door without any requirement that he open it. They stood by the fire for another 20 minutes, talking about smaller things, the quality of the Crane's cook's beef roast, which was exceptional, and the fact that 3 inches of snow were forecast for the weekend. When the evening broke up and people began finding their coats, Lewis held hers for her to put on, which was a small and courtly gesture that she noted without making anything of it out loud. Outside in the cold blue moonlight, he walked with her to the end of the Crane's path, where their ways split as they always did, her north toward the rooming house and him south, eventually toward the ranch. "Florence," he said, and she stopped and turned because it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice was something she wanted to hold still for. "Yes. I am glad Gus told you," he said, just that. She nodded once. "Good night, Lewis." "Good night," he said. She walked home through the moonlit snow and did not smile this time, because it was not a smiling feeling. It was a more serious feeling. It was a feeling like standing at the beginning of something real. 2 weeks passed, and they were 2 weeks in which Florence became aware of a shift in Lewis Donovan, subtle as a change in the light but unmistakable if you knew what you were looking for. He was at the medical office more frequently. He stayed longer. He talked more freely, not about everything, not yet, but more, and what he said had less of the careful quality to it, less of the managed surface. He brought her a book one afternoon, a collection of natural history essays he had found in the back room of the general store, which had a small and largely accidental lending library's worth of abandoned volumes. He had seen her reading the prior week and noticed the title and thought she might like this one. She did like it. She thanked him with genuine pleasure, and the expression on his face when she took the book was of a man who had given something simple and found it received as something more. December arrived, cold and clear and absolute. The plains in December had a quality that Florence was still learning to inhabit, a silence so large it was not really silence at all but a kind of sound in itself, the sound of distance and wind and time. She had been in Caldwell 3 months, and she felt that she had been here always, or perhaps that Cincinnati had been a dream, and this was where she had always been heading. She thought about Lewis constantly, not in the consuming, anxious way of someone who does not know if she is loved, but in the way of someone who suspects she is, and who is being patient with the unfolding because she respects the man enough to let him unfold in his own time. The evening it happened was a Saturday, the 9th of December, and it happened because Florence had been called to the Donovan ranch. One of Lewis's cowhands, a young man named Patrick Reeves who was 19 and from Missouri, had been kicked by a horse and had sustained a serious bruise to his ribs and possibly more. Florence rode out with her bag in the late afternoon, the sky going pink and gold in the west the way it did out here in a way that never stopped being astonishing, and she found the bunkhouse scene of 7 men in various states of concern over one man who was refusing to be concerned about himself, which was entirely typical. She examined Patrick thoroughly and determined that the ribs were severely bruised but not broken, which was fortunate, and which she communicated to him, along with strict instructions about what he was not to do for the next 3 weeks, which he received with the healthy skepticism of a 19-year-old boy who thought being young was a form of protection. By the time she had finished, bandaged the visible injury, left a preparation for pain, and spoken at length to Gus about enforcing the restrictions she had laid out for Patrick, the sun had fully set and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an hour. The sky was filling with the kind of cloud cover that preceded the heavy snowstorms, and Gus looked at the sky and then at Florence with an expression that said she should not try to ride back to Caldwell tonight. She was still deciding whether she agreed with this assessment when Lewis appeared in the bunkhouse doorway. He had been at the far end of the property when she arrived and had come in when he saw the light and the horses. "You should not ride back tonight," he said, having looked at the same sky Gus had just looked at. "I was just considering that," she said. "You are welcome to stay. There is a proper guest room in the house. I will have Gus's wife make it up." He said it directly and with no awkwardness, which made it easy to accept, which she thought was deliberate on his part. Gus's wife, Clara, was a woman Florence had met twice in town and had liked enormously both times. She was a compact, practical woman of 40 who had been cooking for the ranch house since before Gus had the good sense to marry her, and she managed the domestic side of the Donovan ranch with the same efficient authority that Florence managed the medical office. She made up the guest room with a speed and hospitality that told Florence the room was not often used, and she set an extra plate at the ranch house table without any fuss. They ate supper, Lewis and Florence and Clara and Gus, and it was a good meal, a proper meal of beef and root vegetables and corn bread, and the conversation was easy, the 4 of them talking about Patrick's indestructibility and the storm coming and the upcoming Christmas social that Caldwell held in the church and had apparently become an event of significant community importance. After Gus and Clara had gone back to the foreman's small house adjacent to the main building, Florence and Lewis were alone in the ranch house for the first time, and the quality of that aloneness was comfortable rather than uncomfortable, which she thought told both of them something. He had a fire going in the main room, a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall and threw good warm light across the pine floors, and the simple furniture that spoke of a man who needed function more than decoration. There were a few photographs on the mantel that she had not been close enough to see clearly. There were books stacked on a table near the window. There was a child's wooden horse on a shelf near the fireplace that looked very old and very worn, and had clearly been handled many times by small hands, and her eyes moved over it once and then away, because she understood what it was. He made coffee, which she accepted, and they settled on either side of the fire with their cups, and the storm was beginning outside, the first whisper of wind against the windows, and Florence thought there was no place in the world she would rather be at this exact moment than in this room with this man and this fire. She looked at the mantel. She looked at the wooden horse on the shelf. She thought about the door that Gus had described, the one Lewis had locked and did not walk past. She thought about what it might mean to him to have someone walk past it with him, not to force it open, but to simply walk beside him toward it. "Tell me about your sons," she said quietly. She said it gently. She said it the way she would speak to a patient, with care and without demand, the way you offer a door and step aside and let the person choose whether to walk through it. Lewis went very still. His coffee cup was in both hands and he looked into the fire, and she watched the stillness move through him, and she did not take it back and she did not soften it further. She had said what she meant. A long moment passed. The wind found the eaves. Their names were James and Thomas, he said. His voice was very quiet. It did not break, but it was close to something that might, and Florence did not move, did not speak, did not do anything that might interrupt what was beginning. James was 7 and Thomas was 5 when they died, he said. The winter of '79 was very cold here. We had not had a winter like it in the memory of anyone in the territory. The fever came through in January. He paused. Margaret went first, my wife. She was gone in 3 days. I did not have time to understand that she was dying before she was dead. He set the coffee down with great care, as if the deliberateness of small physical acts could manage what was happening inside him. I thought the boys would be all right. I thought children fought sickness differently. I thought I could keep them here by sheer force of will, which is a foolish thing to think, but I thought it. Florence listened. She held very still. James went on the 8th day. Thomas 2 days after that. He stopped talking. He looked into the fire. I have not said their names out loud since the service. That was 3 years ago this coming January. James and Thomas, Florence said softly. He looked at her, and what was in his face when she said their names back to him was something she would remember for the rest of her life. It was the look of a man who had been carrying something in complete silence for so long that the sound of another person acknowledging it was almost too much to hold. James was older, but Thomas was the louder one, he said, and there was something else in his voice now, something that surprised her, something almost warm. James was very serious for 7 years old. He had opinions about everything. He had decided he was going to be a doctor when he grew up. He almost smiled, and this time it was a real one, faint but real, and it was the most beautiful thing Florence had seen in a long time. Thomas was all noise and movement. He could not sit still for 30 consecutive seconds. He once convinced the horse to walk into the kitchen, and I still do not know how he did it. Florence made a soft sound, the kind that meant I am here, go on. And Lewis talked. He talked about his sons in the way that a man talks who has held something inside him for 3 years with such force that when the pressure finally releases, the words do not come out in an orderly fashion, but in the way of something long contained, naturally and fully, and with a life of their own. He talked about the way James used to get up before dawn and sit on the porch looking at the stars, and how Lewis would come out and find him there and sit with him without either of them talking, because James had decided that the best watching was silent watching. He talked about the way Thomas laughed, a full-body event that took him over completely and left him helpless on the floor sometimes, and how Lewis had spent considerable effort engineering situations that would produce that laugh because it was the best sound he had ever heard in his life. He talked about the way both boys had their mother's eyes, dark and steady, and how he had needed to stop looking at photographs for a full year after because it was more than he could manage. He talked about teaching James to saddle a horse and how serious James had been about getting every step right, how he had repeated the procedure 15 times that first morning until he was satisfied with his competence. He talked about Thomas trying to follow James in everything and how Thomas had decided he was going to saddle his own horse the first day he watched his brother do it, and how the horse in question had been remarkably patient with the attempt. Florence sat by the fire and listened to all of it, and the fire burned down from its high evening brightness to the deeper, steadier warmth of coals, and neither of them noticed the time, and outside the storm had arrived in earnest, wind and snow against the windows, and inside there was firelight and the quiet, extraordinary thing that was happening between them. He talked about Margaret, too, after a while. About how she had come to Kansas from Virginia, how she had disliked the flat horizon at first and then learned to love it, how she had taught herself to bake in a cast-iron oven that gave trouble in the cold, and had produced the best bread Lewis had ever tasted. How she had been afraid of prairie thunderstorms but had refused to show it to the boys because she did not want them to be afraid. He talked about the winter evening he had found her standing in the doorway watching snow fall with both boys asleep on the settle behind her, and how she had looked at him when he came in, and how that look had been one of pure and ordinary happiness, and how he had not known until much later that that was the thing to hold on to. When he stopped talking, the fire had burned very low, just coals now, orange and breathing, throwing a dim warm light across the room. The wind was still going outside. The ranch house was quiet around them. Lewis looked at the fire for a moment, and then he looked at Florence, and the expression on his face was of a man who has just set down something very heavy after a very long time and is discovering that his arms do not know what to do without the weight. "I have not said any of that to anyone," he said, "in 3 years." "I know," she said. "Why did you ask?" She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider all things. "Because I could see that you needed to," she said. "And because I wanted to know them. James and Thomas. They were real people and they were part of your life, and I wanted to know them even if only this way." He looked at her for a long time in the firelight. She let him look. "Florence," he said, and it was the same thing as before when he had said her name in the moonlight outside the Crane house. It was not a question or a statement. It was just her name in his voice, which meant something specific that she did not need a translation for. "Yes," she said. He reached out and took her hand. It was a slow and deliberate gesture, nothing sudden about it, the action of a man who understood the weight of what he was doing and chose it knowingly. His hand was large and calloused and warm from the fire, and it enclosed hers completely, and she turned her hand to hold his back, and they sat like that in the low light of the dying fire with the storm outside and the silence of the ranch house around them. She thought about everything she felt, and she thought it was right, all of it, the timing and the person and the place. She had not looked for this. She had come to Caldwell for a position and a purpose, and she had found both. And this had arrived alongside them, quietly and without announcement, the way the best things apparently did. In the morning the storm had passed and the world was white and perfectly still. Florence looked out the guest room window at the clean expanse of snow across the ranch yard, the frozen water trough, the bunkhouse with its single thread of smoke rising straight up in windless air, and felt the particular peace of a world that has been renewed overnight. Clara made breakfast with the efficiency and generosity that characterized everything she did, and the four of them ate together, and Lewis and Florence did not behave differently to each other in front of Gus and Clara. But Gus noticed something, because Gus noticed everything and lacked the restraint to pretend he did not. And he spent the meal with the expression of a man trying very hard to keep a large satisfaction to himself, which was a losing battle. Florence rode back to Caldwell in the morning light through 6 inches of new snow, and the plains were blinding and beautiful, and she was happy in a way that was deep and uncomplicated, which was the rarest kind. She was aware that they had not declared anything, had not said anything concrete to each other about what they were or what they intended. But she was also aware that declarations were not always necessary, that some understandings arrived complete without requiring assembly, and that what had passed between them in the firelight was more significant than any formal statement of intent. The declaration, when it came in Lewis's way, which was direct and without ceremony and all the more affecting for it. He rode into Caldwell on the following Monday afternoon and came to the medical office and waited in the entry until Florence had finished with a patient, a woman with a persistent cough that Florence was treating with some concern. When the woman had gone and Florence came out of the examination room, Lewis was standing in the entry with his hat in his hands. "I would like to call on you properly," he said. "With your permission." Florence looked at him for a moment. He was not nervous exactly, but he was attentive, holding the intention of the moment with care. "You have my permission," she said. He nodded once. "Saturday evening if that suits." "That suits," she said. He put his hat back on and went out, and Florence turned and found Dr. Feld in the doorway of his office with an expression of quiet delight that he was making no effort to conceal. "Not a word," she said. "I was not going to say a word," he said, and then immediately said, "He is a good man, Florence." "I know he is," she said. "That is why I said yes." The courtship of Florence Merritt and Lewis Donovan in the winter of 1882 was, like the man himself, unhurried and deliberate, and more substantial than its outward form might suggest. He called on her Saturday evenings, which became a fixture as reliable as the weather reports he consulted each morning. He took her to supper at the hotel dining room, which was not grand but was the best Caldwell offered, and they talked for hours the way two people do who have years of conversation stored up between them and are working through it with real pleasure. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, out across the snow-covered plains, and he showed her the land the way a man shows a place to someone he wants to understand it, not as scenery, but as substance, the way the light fell in the late afternoon, the way the river cut through the eastern edge of the ranch property, the stand of cottonwoods near the south fence that turned gold in fall and silver in winter, and were, Lewis said with complete seriousness, one of the finest things he had in his life. She visited the ranch again in December for a Christmas supper that Clara organized with festive intent and an impressive amount of food. The whole of the small ranch community gathered, Lewis's cowhands and their families and a few neighbors from adjacent properties, and Florence moved through it with the ease of someone who was finding her place in a landscape both literal and human. She helped Clara in the kitchen for an hour in the afternoon, and they talked while they worked with the frank directness of two women who respected each other's competence. And Clara told Florence, without preamble or excessive sentiment, that Lewis had not looked the way he was looking since before the winter of '79, and that whatever Florence was doing, she should continue doing it. Florence thanked her. Clara told her not to thank her and get back to chopping. The Christmas social at the Caldwell church was the event of the social year, and Florence attended in the blue dress she had brought from Cincinnati and had not yet had occasion to wear, and Lewis, who had come in clean-shaved and in his best coat, stood at the door of the church when she arrived and looked at her with an expression that he did not trouble to compose into something neutral. "You look very fine," he said, which for Lewis was the equivalent of a considerable speech. "So do you," she said, which was the truth. They danced twice, which was noticed by the entire room, and they stood together for most of the evening, and Caldwell collectively registered that Lewis Donovan was being restored to the world, and was quietly, warmly glad about it. In January, on the anniversary of his family's death, Lewis was not in town and Florence did not go to him. She sent word through Gus that she was thinking of him, but she understood that there were things that needed to be faced in private, in the land where they had happened, and she respected that. She went about her work at the medical office, and she thought about James and Thomas and Margaret with a tenderness that surprised her, because she had never met them, and yet she felt she knew them, from the firelight conversation that had given them back to the world. Lewis came to the medical office 3 days after the anniversary. He did not explain where he had been or what he had done with those 3 days. He looked tired but not broken, and she thought the difference between those things was significant. "Thank you for the message through Gus," he said. "Of course," she said. He took a breath. "It was the first year I did not spend the anniversary entirely alone," he said. "You were far away, but you were not absent. That mattered more than I expected it to." She reached out and put her hand on his arm briefly, a gesture that said everything she needed to say, and he covered her hand with his for a moment, and that was enough. February arrived and the deep cold began, at last, to suggest the possibility of its own ending. The snow on the plains developed that particular crust that meant the temperatures were cycling, freezing by night and softening barely by day. The the first almost imperceptible intimation of spring. Florence had been in Caldwell 5 months, and she felt entirely at home in it, had made friends, had established her place in the medical practice, had become a person the town trusted and turned to in difficulty. Her courtship with Lewis had settled into something that felt very solid and very real, a mutual recognition that had been moving, since the evening in the ranch house firelight, toward an inevitable point. She thought about it clearly and with genuine joy. The life that seemed to be assembling itself around her out here on these wide plains. In the second week of February, on an evening that was cold but clear, Lewis came to call on a Wednesday rather than a Saturday, which was unusual, and when Florence came to the door of the rooming house parlor where he waited, he was standing with his hat in his hands again, the way he had stood in the medical office entry the day he had asked to call on her properly. "I need to ask you something," he said. She sat down. He did not sit. He stood in front of the fire in the parlor and looked at her with that direct look, the real one. "I have been thinking about this for several weeks," he said. "I wanted to be certain I was asking for the right reasons and not the wrong ones. I needed to be sure I was asking because of who you are and not because I am lonely, which would not be fair to you." She waited. "I am asking because of who you are," he said. "There is no one else like you, Florence. Not here and not anywhere I have been, and I have been enough places to have some basis for that statement. You came here and you were kind without being soft, and you listened without prying, and you asked about my sons on the night when the fire was going down, and you said their names back to me, and I have thought about that every day since. I am asking because when I think about the future, I cannot make it make sense without you in it." Florence breathed carefully. "I am asking if you will marry me," he said. The parlor fire made its small sounds. Outside, the street of Caldwell was quiet in the February evening, and the stars were very bright over the plains. "Yes," Florence said. "Lewis, yes." He crossed the parlor in 3 steps and took both her hands and held them and looked at her with everything he had been keeping behind that careful face for 6 years, and it was, she thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. He kissed her then, in the parlor of the rooming house, a first kiss that was deliberate and certain and warm, the kind that did not ask for permission because it had already been given, and Florence leaned into it with her whole self, and thought that she had ridden into Caldwell on a broken wagon wheel and come out the other side of it completely transformed, which was the kind of thing that only happened in the real world, the one outside the door, the one that did not follow predictable rules. They were married in April, on a Saturday that spring announced with crocuses along the fence lines, and a sky that had gone from February gray to April blue as completely as a decision. The church was full. Clara had organized the reception in the natural and authoritative way Clara organized everything, and the spread of food on the trestle tables outside the church was a declaration of community investment in the outcome of this marriage. Florence wore her blue dress again, the Cincinnati one, and pinned her hair with more success than usual because Clara had helped. Lewis wore a new coat and looked like a man who was walking into the best part of his life with full awareness of that fact. Dr. Feld stood up with Lewis, who had no family nearby to call on for the purpose, and Margaret Crane stood with Florence, and the minister read the vows in the good old formal language that seemed right for the occasion. When the minister asked Lewis if he would take Florence as his wife, Lewis said "I will" with a calm directness that made several people in the pews reach quietly for handkerchiefs, because it was the tone of a man who had loved and lost and was choosing, knowing everything now about how much could be lost, to love again. Florence said "I will" in her own voice, steady and clear and certain. They rode out to the ranch that evening in the last of the spring light, and the cottonwoods Lewis had shown her were beginning their first green of the season, and the river caught the low sun in long flashes, and she sat beside him on the wagon bench with his arm around her, and thought that the land was not empty. It had never been empty. It was full of everything that had happened here and would happen here, and she was part of that now, and she was glad. The first spring at the ranch was a revelation for Florence, who had known hard work in Cincinnati in hospitals and clinics, but who had not known the particular all-encompassing nature of ranch work in the season of renewal. She continued her work at the medical office in town, riding in 4 days a week on a steady roan gelding that Lewis had picked for her from his small string of horses, with a care that she recognized as love in practical form. Dr. Feld had retained her entirely, and was, if anything, more relieved to have her there than before, because he had gotten accustomed to the standard she had established and could not imagine returning to the previous arrangement. She and Lewis built their life together with the same quality that Lewis brought to everything, purposefully, without waste, and with genuine attention to what the other person needed. They talked in the evenings the way Florence had hoped they would, easy and honest, about the ranch and the town and the larger world that was coming to the plains, whether the plains were ready or not. The railroads were pushing further, and the fences were going up, and Kansas was becoming something different from what it had been 10 years ago, and Lewis watched it all with a clear eye and an equanimity that Florence found deeply reassuring. She put James and Thomas's names into the fabric of their life together, gently and naturally, not as an exercise in grief, but as an act of keeping them present. She asked Lewis to tell her about them when stories came up, when something on the ranch reminded him of something one of them had done, and he told her, and she laughed when he told her the Thomas stories, which he told more freely as the months passed, and she felt sometimes that she was getting to know 2 small boys she had never met and never would, and that this was a gift she had not expected to receive and was grateful for. The wooden horse on the shelf stayed where it was. Nobody moved it. It was not a monument or a relic. It was just a small boy's toy, worn smooth by small hands, and its presence in the house was the presence of the people who had mattered, which was right and proper, and as it should be. Summer on the Kansas plains was a world Florence had not been prepared for, the heat and the sky and the extraordinary fecundity of the land in the growing months. The ranch expanded that summer in a modest and sensible way, Lewis having identified an opportunity to acquire the adjacent parcel when its owner decided to move east, and the process of incorporating the new land kept him busy and alive with purpose in a way Florence was glad to see. In August, Florence told Lewis she was expecting a child. He was in the barn when she found him, working on a harness that needed mending, and she stood in the barn door with the sun behind her and told him, and he set the harness down and came across the barn to her with a pace that had nothing casual about it. And he stood in front of her and searched her face the way he sometimes did when he needed to be sure of something. And then he pulled her to him and held her, just held her, his hands on her back and her face against his chest, and did not say anything for a long moment. When he stepped back, his eyes were bright, and he was not a man who cried easily, and the fact that he was close to it was something she understood completely. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Everything is as it should be." He nodded and kept nodding, processing it, and then he almost smiled, and then the smile completed itself fully, without the reservation that usually held it back, and it was the best thing she had ever seen. "James would have been insufferable about a new baby," he said after a moment. "He would have had opinions about everything. What to name it, what it should be allowed to do, whether it could sleep in his room. And Thomas," she said, "Thomas would have taught it to cause trouble from the first week." Florence laughed, and Lewis laughed with her, and the barn was full of it, real laughter, the complete kind. They told Clara and Gus that evening, and Clara produced an expression of deep satisfaction that was equal parts "I knew it would happen, and I am genuinely moved," and she embraced Florence with the firmness of someone who considered this personal good news. Gus shook Lewis's hand, and then thought better of it and gripped his forearm the way men do when handshakes are not quite enough. Florence reduced her days at the medical office in September, not stopping entirely, because she and Dr. Feld had worked out a schedule that allowed her to continue a reduced role, but pacing herself as she moved through the middle months of her pregnancy with the pragmatic self-awareness of a woman trained in medicine who was not going to pretend. She did not know exactly what her body needed. Lewis was present and attentive in the way that Florence had come to expect from him, which was to say completely and without drama. He did not fuss. He did not treat her as fragile. He made sure the practical conditions of her life were managed and easy, checked in on her with a quiet regularity, and talked to her in the evenings about everything and nothing in the way that was, she thought, possibly the most intimate form of love there was. On the evenings that were cold and they had the fire going in the main room, Florence sometimes thought back to that first night in the ranch house, the night of the storm, when Lewis had said James and Thomas for the first time in 3 years and had talked until the fire burned low. She thought about what it had cost him to open that door and what it had given back to both of them, and she felt an enormous tenderness for that moment, for the courage it had required and the trust it had expressed, trust in her, in the fact that she would receive it with care. She had received it with care. She always would. The winter of 1883 was milder than the winter of 1879 had been, and Florence was aware of Lewis's careful monitoring of the weather through November and December with a gratitude that went beyond meteorology. She did not say anything about it directly because she did not need to. They understood each other. But she made sure he knew, in the many small ways available to a woman who loves a man and lives with him daily, that she was aware of what he was doing and that she valued it. Christmas was at the ranch house that year, a proper gathering that included Gus and Clara and 2 of the hands who had nowhere else to go. And Florence and Clara spent 2 days in the kitchen producing a meal that was ambitious and successful. And the house was full of warmth and noise and the smell of food and pine. And Lewis sat at the head of the table looking at his table of people with an expression that Florence read without difficulty, that said, "This is more than I expected to have again." She felt the same. She felt it every day. Their son was born on the 14th of January, 1884, in the ranch house bedroom, with Dr. Feld in attendance and Clara at Florence's side throughout a labor that was long and honest and ultimately triumphant. Lewis was outside the bedroom door for most of it, which was where men were expected to be and where Florence was glad he was, because she did not want him to see her in the most difficult hours of it, not out of pride exactly, but out of the practical knowledge that the memory would stay with him in a way that would not be useful. When the baby announced himself to the household with a voice considerably larger than his size suggested possible, and when Florence heard Lewis's footsteps in the hall stop, and then wait, and when Dr. Feld had done everything necessary and Clara had wrapped the child in the flannel she had prepared and handed him to Florence, and when Florence was holding her son and felt the full and staggering weight of that, she called for Lewis. He came in and stood at the bedside and looked at his wife and his son with an expression that had no category for it, that was beyond the vocabulary available to the human face. And then he sat carefully on the edge of the bed beside her, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the practiced gentleness of a man who had held babies before and remembered how. "He is very angry about being here," Florence said, because the boy was still expressing his displeasure at the general indignity of birth with impressive volume. "Thomas was the same," Lewis said softly, and his voice was rough, and he was looking at the baby with such enormous feeling that Florence had to look away for a moment because the privacy of it felt like something she should not fully witness. "What shall we call him?" she said. Lewis looked at her. She looked at him. "Thomas," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Florence," he said. "It is the right name," she said. "If you want it, there should be a Thomas on this ranch." He looked back at the baby, who had settled slightly, finding his bearings in the world. "Thomas James Donovan," Lewis said. She had not suggested the middle name. He had chosen it himself, and the offering of it, James for his older brother, was the kind of grace note that told her everything about who this man was. "Thomas James," she said. "Yes, that is exactly right." Lewis held his son for a long time, and Clara came and went with quiet efficiency, and Dr. Feld sat in the corner chair and drank his coffee with the satisfied air of a man who has witnessed the best outcome of his profession. And Florence rested against her pillows and felt the exhaustion and the joy in equal and enormous measure, and thought that the whole of her journey from Cincinnati, the broken wagon wheel, the medical office, the nights of careful friendship and the evening of firelight honesty, the courtship and the marriage and the year and a half they had built together, it had all been moving toward this exact room, this moment, this small and astonishing person in his father's arms. Thomas James Donovan was a healthy, loud, opinionated baby who became a healthy, loud, opinionated boy with remarkable speed, the way babies do when you are paying close attention. He had Florence's gray eyes and Lewis's dark hair, and a temperament that combined both parents' traits in a way that was sometimes charming and sometimes spectacularly challenging, and everyone on the ranch adored him to a degree that would have been alarming if he had not been an essentially good-natured child underneath the considerable noise. Lewis was a father again with a wholeness that Florence watched and felt profound gratitude for. He carried Thomas on his shoulders across the ranch yard. He sat with him in the mornings the way he had once sat with James, in the quiet dark before dawn, teaching him the names of stars, and Florence sometimes watched from the window, these two dark heads together against the early sky, and felt the fullness of it move through her like something physical. He talked to Thomas about his brothers. When Thomas was old enough to understand, which was older than Florence had expected it to take, Lewis told him about James and Thomas, that was, about the older Thomas and the boy he had been. He did not make it somber. He made it a gift, two real people given to a small boy who had not known them, described in enough detail that they lived in his imagination the way real people do. Florence overheard one of these conversations from the hallway outside Thomas's room one evening, Lewis's voice quiet and easy, telling the story of the horse in the kitchen, and she stood in the hallway with her hand over her mouth and her eyes full, and did not go in because the moment was complete without her. 2 years after Thomas was born, in the spring of 1886, Florence told Lewis she was expecting again. He received the news with less surprise than the first time, but with no less joy, and he held her in the kitchen where she had found him, and they stood together for a long moment in the good ordinary light of an April morning, and felt the rightness of their life. Their second child was a girl, born in October of 1886, and they named her Margaret Ellen Donovan. The first name was deliberate and understood between them without being discussed. Florence had thought about it and brought it to Lewis carefully one evening in the late summer, and he had listened with his whole self the way he always did, and then he had said yes, simply yes, and that was that. Margaret was quieter than her brother from the first week, a watchful and apparently thoughtful person who observed the world with a gravity that made Florence think of the older James, as Lewis had described him. She had Lewis's eyes, the dark steady ones, and Florence's coloring, and she was, by the time she was 2 years old, unquestionably the person Thomas was most devoted to on the earth, which produced scenes of a domestic sweetness that reduced Clara regularly to expressions of barely concealed emotional disruption. Caldwell changed around them in those years, the way the whole of Kansas was changing, the open range giving way by degrees to the fenced and ordered landscape of a more settled country. The cattle drives that had defined the town in its early years were diminishing, the railheads moving further west, the trail herds smaller. Some of the ranchers sold up and moved on. Some of them fought the change and lost to it anyway. Lewis adapted, as he adapted to most things, with clear eyes and steady hands, diversifying the ranch's operation, bringing in crops on the southern acreage where the fence dispute had once raged, finding the balance between the old world of the open range and the new world that was arriving whether he welcomed it or not. He had made peace with the farmers, actually. There was one in particular, a Swedish man named Eric Sven, who had come with his family to the land east of the Donovan property in 1884, and who had arrived with the wariness of a homesteader expecting trouble from the established rancher next door. Lewis had ridden over the first week and introduced himself without agenda, and had helped the family through their first winter in ways that were practical and unsentimental. And by 1886, the two families shared fence lines without conflict and a quiet mutual respect that Florence thought was exactly the kind of thing that would make the plains livable for everyone, if enough people were willing to attempt it. She continued her work with Dr. Feld in a part-time capacity that evolved with the demands of her family but never stopped altogether, because she was a nurse, and she had always been a nurse, and the work mattered to her in a way that was fundamental and non-negotiable, and Lewis had never for a moment suggested otherwise. He drove her to town on her working days when the season allowed. He managed the children's mornings on those days with Gus and Clara's help, and without complaint. He understood, with the clarity of a man who loved specifically and not generally, that Florence's competence and purpose were part of who she was, not separate from it, and that her happiness required both him and her work together. Dr. Feld retired in 1888, which Florence had seen coming for a year, and had been preparing for in the form of correspondence with a younger doctor from St. Louis who was looking for a position west. The new doctor, a man named Robert Crane who was 29 and excellent, arrived in May of that year, and Florence spent 3 months training him to the practice, and its patience with the thoroughness of someone who took handover seriously. By August he was established, and Florence reduced her official role to 2 days a week and a standing arrangement for emergencies, which suited everyone. That autumn of 1888 was golden in the way that certain autumns are, the particular confluence of weather and season and circumstance that makes everything seem to have arrived at the right moment simultaneously. Thomas was 4.5, and in a constant state of investigation of the natural world that exhausted and delighted everyone around him. Margaret was 2, and conducting her own quieter investigations with methodical intensity. The ranch was in good shape. The new south acreage was producing well. The Sven family to the east had expanded, and the two households exchanged visits and produce with comfortable regularity. On a Saturday evening in October, Florence and Lewis sat by the fire in the main room after the children were in bed, the kind of evening they tried to protect as their own, the fire good and high, the wind outside doing nothing alarming, the house settled around them with its particular quiet. Thomas had asked Lewis that afternoon to tell him about the stars again, and Lewis had spent an hour in the yard with the boy on his shoulders pointing at the sky, and Florence had watched from the porch and felt, not for the first time and not for the last, that she was looking at the whole of everything she wanted. "He asked me today why the star names are in Latin," Lewis said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the Romans named them and Latin was their language." He paused. "Then he asked who the Romans were and I realized I have some reading to do." Florence smiled. "James would have known," Lewis smiled back. "James would have already read everything available on the subject and had a correction ready. And Thomas would have knocked something over while you were trying to teach it." "Usually the candle," Lewis agreed. They sat with that for a moment, the warmth of it, these two people they had loved placed gently into the conversation, belonging there, part of the evening. "Are you happy?" Lewis asked. It was a question he asked her sometimes, not out of uncertainty about the answer but out of a real and continuing desire to hear it, to have it confirmed in the actual world where things could be checked. "Lewis," she said, "I am so happy it frightens me a little." He reached over and took her hand from where it rested on her knee, the way he had the first night in this room, the same gesture, 6 years and 2 children and a whole life later. "I know," he said. "Me too." Outside the window, the October plains were dark and enormous, and the sky was full of stars that a small boy had learned to name, and the fire in the Donovan ranch house threw its warm light across the pine floor, and the books by the window, and the worn wooden horse on the shelf that had belonged to a boy named Thomas, for whom their son was named, and the photographs on the mantel, and the good ordinary furniture of a life that was real and present and fully inhabited. Florence looked at the fire and thought about the evening she had asked Lewis to talk about his sons. She thought about how he had said their names into the quiet of the room and how the sound of them had changed something, for both of them, had opened a door that let the grief out and let the light in, and how everything since had been built on the foundation of that honesty, that trust, that willingness to be known completely by another person and to let it matter. She thought about James, who would have been 18 now, serious and probably remarkable. She thought about Thomas that was, who would have been 16 and spectacularly chaotic and magnificent. She held them in her mind with love, as she always did, these two boys who had become part of her though she had never met them, part of the family she had married into, part of the history of this house and this land. She thought about her Thomas, asleep upstairs, who would ask tomorrow about the Romans and would need an answer, and who laughed the way his father had described the first Thomas laughing, fully and helplessly, and with his whole body, a laugh that could break you open with love. She thought about Margaret, also asleep, who watched the world with the careful attention of someone who was building a comprehensive understanding of it and was not going to be rushed. She thought about Lewis beside her, holding her hand in the firelight, this man who had been made and unmade and made again, who had carried his silence for 3 years and then spoken into a room and been heard, who was the best person she knew. "Lewis," she said. "Yes, I am glad my wagon wheel broke." He was quiet for a moment, and then he made a sound that was laughter, real and free, the kind she had been working for since she arrived, and he raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was old-fashioned and wholly sincere. "So am I," he said. "God, so am I." The fire burned on. The plains lay dark and wide around the house. In the months that followed there would be more seasons and more work, and more of the 10,000 ordinary details that make up a life. The horses and the fence lines and the summer heat and the winter cold, and the children growing and asking their questions, and the town of Caldwell changing around them in the long drift of the years. There would be mornings of pure and uncomplicated happiness and evenings that settled over the ranch like something meant to last in days, when Florence rode across the south pasture in the clean spring air and felt, as she always felt, that the whole of the wide country was hers, not in the possessive sense, but in the sense of belonging to it and it belonging to her. This woman from Cincinnati who had come west on a broken wheel and found something she had not known to look for. Lewis Donovan, who had been alone in his grief for 3 years, who had locked the door and kept walking past it, who had stood in a widow's stillness at the edge of his own life, was no longer at the edge of anything. He was in the middle of it, deep in it, surrounded by it, the life that had kept assembling itself around him even when he had not been certain he wanted it to. His sons were honored and remembered and loved, their names in the daily air of the house, their histories known to the small people who came after them. His wife was beside him, as honest and certain as the land itself. His daughter had his eyes. His son had his laugh and his name. He was a man who had survived the unsurvivable and come out the other side of it into something he had not dared to believe was possible. And he understood, in the way that only people who have truly lost things understand, what he had. He understood it every single day. The ranch house stood on the Kansas plains in the long light of the evening, its windows warm, its chimney going, the cottonwood silver in the October air, the river catching what remained of the sunset in long and brilliant flashes. And inside it, in the good ordinary fire-lit room, Florence and Lewis sat together and held on, and the world outside was vast and cold and full of stars, and inside it was warm and they were home.